later. So it looks like we are recording. So welcome everybody. Again, Sarah Breyer at NJJN, and this is really a meeting of our racial justice working group that we decided to broaden out to the whole NJJN community. And for folks who are on the call who aren't part of our racial justice working group, we've been meeting for a few years, and the working group is really helping to guide NJJN's work in being an anti-racist membership organization. Over the years, they've engaged in some joint projects and collective projects amongst themselves for the benefit of the larger membership, and are building out learning opportunities for our members around anti-racism. If you're interested in joining the Racial Justice Working Group, we would love to have you join us, and just email info@njjn.org and we'll get you hooked up. With that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Josh Gordon, who's our new communications manager, who's going to do some housekeeping and introduce Angelique Kedem for us.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Racial Equity Toolkit webinar. We have a great presenter with us who's been working in racial justice and social justice for a long time. So you are in for a treat. A few things before we get started. I want to go through some housekeeping options so we're all on the same page. Number one, when you enter the conference, please make sure that you've enabled your audio. You have the option to join the discussion via telephone or using your computer speakers and microphone, but please dial in by phone. You'll find that audio is much better. You should be able to change this setting in your control panel. Number two, because we have so many people on today's webinar, everyone is muted to ensure that there's no distracting background noise. However, we will have a question and answer section later at the end of the presentation, so you'll be able to chime in and let us know what you think, or to ask questions of Angelique Kedem, our presenter. And then on your screen in the upper right-hand corner, you should see a control panel, and if you want to minimize that during the presentation, click on the orange arrow and the panel will be hidden. Click on it again to make it expand to its full size. Again, questions will be taken at the end of the presentation. You can send that directly to me by typing it into the box at the bottom of the control panel and send it to panelists. Again, this webinar is being recorded, and you will have the opportunity to listen to it and pass it on to friends sometime next week. So be on the outlook for that. Now, moving on to an intro of today's speaker. Angelique Kedem joined the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Race, Ethnic, Equity, and Inclusion team as a senior associate in January 2016. Her portfolio is responsible for integrating an equity and inclusion focus into all Casey programs and operations. She has a decade of experience in juvenile justice reform focused on racial, ethnic, and gender disparities, as well as leading the St. Paul Promise Neighborhood initiative as director. Before Angelique gets started, she had a brief video for you all to watch, and so I will show you that right now.
And a big part of the issue when creating a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy movement is an understanding of how race and racism were constructed in the United States through law, and how those laws informed our culture in much the same way those corporate rights have been constructed through the law to ensure rule of the wealthy minority over the majority, and how our culture reinforces and legitimizes that lack of democracy. Right from the very beginning, Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution defined people as property. You see, the authors of the Constitution were very interested in protecting their property, including slaves. No person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Indigenous communities are forced from their homelands. Over 10 years, 100,000 Native children and adults marched thousands of miles west into unknown arid territory. 15,000 do not survive the journey. But over 25 million acres of land is made available for white settlers. 1854, the People versus Hall. Non-whites are barred from testifying in court. No black, mulatto, or Indian shall be allowed to give evidence in favor of or against a white man. 1857, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Free blacks are taxed, but still have no rights of citizenship granted to whites. 1862, Emancipation Proclamation in District of Columbia. Slaves are freed in D.C., but former slave owners are reimbursed for slaves given up. Whites are paid over $1 million in reparations for lost property. 1862, Homestead Act. 50 million acres of formerly indigenous land in the West, having been violently invaded by U.S. soldiers in violation of treaties, is distributed by the government at low cost to white settlers only. And 100 million acres of indigenous land are given for free to railroad developers. 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act bans immigration of both skilled and unskilled Chinese laborers. 1924, Johnson-Reed Act creates an immigration quota system based on national origin, favoring Nordics over the inferior races of Asia and Southern and Eastern Europe. 1934, in the wake of the Great Depression, the National Housing Act is implemented, creating a federal housing authority to provide loans and federal subsidies for home ownership. But the FHA mortgage underwriting standards discriminate against non-whites and investment in non-white communities through a process called redlining. 1942, an executive order forces 111,000 Japanese Americans into concentration camps. And the war on drugs declared by Richard Nixon violently targets and imprisons people of color disproportionately through today.
Alrighty, so it is now with my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Angelique Kedem.
The racial divide in Austin used to look a lot different than it does today.
I'm sorry.
After the Civil War, Austin was seen as sort of a refuge for freed slaves, safe from most of the racial violence that plagued the South. By 1880, the city's African-American population lived in pockets spread throughout the city. It was this geographically integrated.
And then you want to share her screen.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Josh. It's my pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and our goal today is to share the Casey Foundation's Race, Ethnic Equity, and Inclusion methodology with you. So the quote that you see on this slide is from our President, Patrick McCarthy. His sentiments explain the need for us to do more than closing gaps and to focus on the conditions required for all children to have the opportunity to reach their full potential. In 2014, Casey produced the Race for Results report, which disaggregates well-being data by race, ethnicity, and place. It tells a story of how far children are positioned from the pathway to success. If you look at the bar chart, you see that no one group has all children meeting all milestones. But African American, American Indian, and Latino children in particular are far from reach to key milestones on the pathway to opportunity. The deep inequities that produce these results have always existed, as you saw in the clip from Democracy Now! and the consequences may be more profound than ever before. We are at a moment in time that compels us to address the persistent inequities that exist throughout the country, and the Casey Foundation has made a choice to intentionally do more. For the first time in the history of the US, kids of color represent the majority. By 2030, the majority of our workforce will be people of color, and by 2050, the majority of people in the US will be people of color. This is important to Casey because our mission is to build brighter futures for all children and families, many of whom are kids of color. We know that when kids do well, we all do well. But we also know that race, ethnicity, and immigration status play a significant role in determining a child's future. So before I go through our framework, I wanted to review some core concepts. Developing a shared language is essential to the success of racial and ethnic equity work. So this is part of ensuring that we understand what we mean when we use various terms with each other. When people think of race and racism, often people consider internalized or interpersonal racism. Internalized racism is how we all internalize racial stereotypes, and interpersonal racism are acts of racism between individuals, whether that's explicit or the microaggressions that people of color often experience daily. These function at the micro level, and implicit bias would fit in this category. Institutional racism is what exists in our institutions. So those are the policies and practices within institutions that produce disparate outcomes. Structural racism is the broader social policies that have oppressed and marginalized people based on race, ethnicity, immigrant status, and social class. These are characterized at the micro level, or the broader social structures we all function in. Casey's work focuses on the structural and institutional racism aspects of inequity. Our work includes making sure that our staff, grantees, and partners language for talking about racial and ethnic equity and inclusion, and the core concepts associated with this work as we've just been through, ensuring that we are addressing or eliminating the structural barriers that perpetuate inequities, and developing and implementing targeted strategies that eliminate the barriers for each racial or ethnic group based on their situation or relationship to the goal. This graphic helps to clarify the difference between two terms that people often use interchangeably, but they are quite different in our work. On the left, you see people of differing heights on the same size box, so equality, receiving the same, and not everyone can see over the fence, which represents barriers in reaching opportunity. On the right, people of differing heights receive the right size box, so equity, getting what they need and considering how people and groups are situated differently, allowing them to see over the fence or overcome those barriers. So we are focused on addressing how groups are situated differently in relation to opportunity, equity, and designing strategies and targeting our resources so that we can help children and families overcome those barriers. We developed the 7-step action guide, our race, ethnic equity, and inclusion framework, to help us achieve equity for the kids and families we serve. So this framework is very much a summary of best practice in the field of racial equity. They represent core steps that characterize effective equity efforts. I will be walking you through each of these 7 steps and hopefully quickly enough so that we can have time for questions at the end. So step 1 is, again, developing a shared language. And if you take a look at the 7-step action guide, you'll see that on the one hand, it's about developing a shared language so that your collaborative or the collective that you bring together or your team, you know what you mean when you use different terms. But it's also about creating a shared vision and lifting up your results, your goals, and how you plan to measure your work. So creating a common language, as we know, helps for easier communication, creates that shared understanding, and again, helps us center around a shared vision and the desired results we are seeking. And it also helps to create a platform for doing coordinated work. Here again, we have a figurative that tries to explain again the difference between 2 key terms in our work, institutional racism and structural racism. So you'll see in the graphic at the top, which is institutional racism, we have children who, the lighter colored children, are being streamed into higher level courses, here calculus, and the brown children are being streamed into a lower level course or welding. And this picture is to demonstrate the policies and practices, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, that happen within institutions that then create these disparate access to opportunity. The structural racism graphic below gives us a sense of what happens in our broader social construct. So we see the lighter colored people, there's a computer, they're doing maybe higher level tech jobs, they're earning higher incomes. We have the brown colored person with tools and a lower wad of cash. So earning a lower income in perhaps a more trade rather than in these technology fields. And as we understand structural and institutional racism, these 2 concepts, what's happening within our institutions, what's happening within our broader social context, they have an interplay. If we have poor education outcomes, it leads to poor wealth outcomes. And so we have a compounding effect. For Casey, we have summarized these big terms into what we call a systems frame. So we think about structural and institutional racism as opposed to interpersonal racism as an example, and race, equity, and inclusion. And what this frame allows us to do is to focus on structures of policy, practice, and procedures. It allows for tangible systems work with the potential for wide-reaching impact to children across the country. And it is aligned with the kind of work that we do. Our frame employs being data-driven, using targeted strategies, programs, and resources that are focused on those children, families, and communities who need them the most. So Professor John A. Powell, a legal scholar and racial equity expert at the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, refers to this as targeted universalism. The term articulates our universal goal of well-being for all children, families, and communities, while employing targeted strategies and solutions that meet the specific needs and contexts of different populations. Step 2 is engaging affected populations and stakeholders. People of color are the most direct stakeholders in the elimination of racism and those with the most first-hand experiences of its effects. we recommend engaging stakeholders who are most adversely affected by racial barriers and bias, those who have been excluded from power, and those who most closely relate to the issue being addressed. The sooner you can engage a diverse mix of stakeholders, the better. Think about how people of different racial groups are situated differently or affected by the issue, what ways stakeholders adversely affected by the issue can be further engaged, and how will exercise real leadership and power. Step 3 is gathering and analyzing disaggregated data. So in the Race for Results report that disaggregated child well-being by race, ethnicity, and place, it was important to do an even deeper disaggregation to see how various groups within larger racial groups are situated differently. As you look at this slide, you can see that we have two charts up here. We're looking at the 10 largest American Indian tribes, and then looking at the Hispanic community. We're measuring children who live in families with incomes at or above 200% of poverty. And as you look at the screen, you can see that for our 10 largest American Indian tribes, we have the Apache tribe, which is at 20%, showing that that is a group where there are very few children living at or above 200% of poverty. And then in our top 10 largest subgroups for the Hispanic community, again, children who live in families with incomes at or above 200% of poverty. We see that as you look at the chart, Mexican American families are at 33%, Honduran at 28%, and Dominican at 32%. So this is important because it informs who it is that we need to be focused on in particular, again, underscoring that we understand how populations are situated differently, because as we design strategies and we try to target resources, we have to think about who it is and how those groups are situated differently and the context of their experience, paying attention to place, ethnicity, what we call conducting a root cause analysis of inequities. So a systems analysis allows us to look at the content data, examining the problems holistically so that we can better understand the root causes. Once you've done that, you're better able to identify strategies that actually address the root causes rather than the symptoms that we often see, like disparity or disproportionality. So this is an example from our Atlanta Civic site. Once you've gotten everyone on the same page with regards to language and begun to engage key stakeholders, you've collected data, you then can analyze to understand the communities you are serving and to make more informed decisions. What you see here in the map of Atlanta is that it shows where the majority of people of color are located and the percent of various ethnic groups living in high income areas. So this kind of data helps you map access, or lack thereof in this case, to opportunities, jobs, transportation, etc. And then you can begin to see patterns which help you understand the root causes of the disparities that you're see in this particular graphic. It's looking at children living in high income areas in Atlanta. And when you disaggregate by race, you see that only 20% of African American children live in high income areas, in comparison to children where it's 94% live in high income areas. Step 5 is about designing effective strategies that target the root causes. Your strategy should have explicit goals of eliminating racism and eliminating structural barriers. They should expand opportunities and advance equity and include measures for how you will address it. So following up on the map we saw of Atlanta, this is what the team there came up with in terms of their analysis. So as they looked at the map and understood that they had very few African American children living in high income areas, they also understood that there was a tremendous lack of access to where jobs were situated. So having an interstate that separates the wealthier majority white communities in the north from poorer majority black communities in the south, and that there are very few rungs on Atlanta's economic ladder that can help families move out of poverty. So there's a confluence of both race and place, and their collective developed networks around key areas, including education and economic development, to begin to address some of these root causes that their data and engagement with the community displayed. So just as an example, they're working on developing and preserving affordable housing, promoting equitable development practices, and building capacity for low to moderate income entrepreneurs and enterprises. Next is a slide that may be of particular interest to you as you advance policy reform. Step 6 is conducting race equity impact assessment for all policies and decision-making. So race equity impact assessments is a systemic examination of how a proposed action or decision will likely affect different racial and ethnic groups. You can assess proposed policies, institutional practices, programs, plans, and budgetary decisions. Racial equity impact assessments are similar to environmental impact assessments, and they help you understand what the impact will be of your proposed action or policy. So it is essentially a set of key questions. What racial disparities do you want to eliminate, reduce, or prevent? Thinking about what stakeholders are most adversely affected by the current problem. Thinking about how those stakeholders would benefit from the solution or policy that you're proposing. Does your proposed solution or policy actually address root causes? And then values that are reflected in the proposed solution. Thinking about as you developed your policy or set of actions, did you have affected groups at the table with you to think with you about, one, what the root causes are to the problem, and then designing solutions? How will the proposed policy, practice, or decision actually affect each group? And then based on the responses to those questions, how would you need to change your proposed policy or action? Finally, step 7 is to continuously evaluate effectiveness and adapt your strategies. So in implementing policy or strategy, evaluating impact, and being in an ongoing monitoring and accountability mode to ensure that you're actually reaching equity. Organizations and systems should be assessing equity progress at every turn and on an ongoing basis. So our default for our systems is that we have disparate outcomes. We have institutional and structural racism at play. So our work to reform systems and to reform our broader social context requires our ongoing attention and monitoring to ensure that we're actually changing systems and helping to sustain that change for equity. Racial equity is not just the absence of discrimination and inequities, but also the presence of deliberate systems and supports to achieve and sustain racial equity. An important caution and difference to pay attention to, that it's not just the absence of discrimination and inequities, but also beginning to think about what are the conditions of equity that are necessary, the conditions that are necessary that would allow children and families who are marginalized, oppressed, impoverished to actually have opportunity and reach their full potential. So some of the lessons learned as we do this work, we understand that to move an equity agenda, leadership support and buy-in is critical. Leadership makes a difference. Historically, the most successful sites in virtually all major juvenile justice reform efforts were places where top-level policymakers clearly and forcefully embraced change and challenged their colleagues and staff to join them in the transformation process. These experiences affirm the importance of naming the problem and of having the authority to enable everyone to confront unpleasant or risky situations. And that from the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, their Disproportionate Minority Contact Pathway, which you can find on the Casey website. It's also very important the goals are explicit and intentional and clearly communicated so that we all know the North Star that we're reaching for and we can spur work along. It is hard work. It's still uncomfortable for people to talk about race, ethnicity, immigration status, especially in our current context, sexual orientation. These are topics where we are socially conditioned to shy away from. So it does require courage, but it can be done, especially when you root your conversation in data, disaggregated data, which helps us to see the issues very clearly. The 7 steps that we have in the framework are not necessarily, but they are interdependent. It's very important that we have community at the table, and it's equally important that we use disaggregated data. Again, have clarity about goals and desired results, be committed for the long term, and we believe that we can prevent structural racism by implementing racial and ethnic equity and inclusion. So with that, I am going to turn my screen over to Josh, and we will field some questions.
Alrighty, hello everyone. Thank you so much, Angelique. We really appreciate it. And now is the time for questions and comments. If you have a question, you can go ahead and send that in through the questions tab on the control panel, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you so you can ask the question directly. So either or. Again, you can send a question in through the questions box, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you that way.
Angelique, this is Sarah. I was wondering if you could give another example of a jurisdiction that has engaged in some of these processes around a policy that they were pursuing.
Sorry. Hi, Josh. Josh?
Yes, we can hear you, Angelique. Sorry, go ahead and answer the question.
I could full question. Can you repeat it, please?
Yes. I was wondering if you could give another example of a jurisdiction that engaged in some of these processes and analyzing their policy. I knew you gave that the great one. I was wondering if you had another one, particularly one that maybe that was already on the table, and they were looking to do an analysis of, okay, well, we want to remove school resource officers from schools. Is this going to have the impact we want? Is there, as a sort of an example of a policy that our members might pursue, and how they would use this toolkit to analyze whether it was going to have an impact on racial equity?
Okay. So if you can give me just a quick moment. I'm also going to send a case study that we have where we go a little deeper into racial equity impact assessments. But I think the top of mind for me, it may not be, like a state level or federal policy. It is a juvenile justice policy, but it's institutional, and probably one that might be familiar to many people. So as we think about detention populations and considering why youth are in detention, in thinking about probation violations, I have an experience where, analyzing probation violations and seeing that we had many youth of color being placed in detention for things like curfew, and think both the harm to young people and engaging with police, because we disaggregated data where we could understand the exact neighborhoods where young people were congregating, and even getting it down to a particular group of young people. Police to think about, okay, we don't want to place young people in detention for curfew. What are some other things that we can begin to think about, other stakeholders that we may need to engage, so that we can have a safe place for those young people to be? One that is top of mind for me, but I am going to send a case study that we have on use of racial equity impact assessments. And in there, you will hear about Voices for Racial Justice and an example from our center. And those are two organizations that use racial equity impact assessments. Voices for Racial Justice in particular, they do a legislative report card. And there's some great, I think there'll be some great examples in there. And also, if you went to their site, as you're thinking about advocating for policy, both thinking about the process and how you might use a racial equity impact assessment to consider what the implications would be before you actually move on something.
That'd be great. And if you send us that case study, we can make it available to folks who are interested. Are there other questions? Well, I have another one for you, Angelique. As you've worked with jurisdictions that are using this toolkit and using these guidelines, I was wondering, what is the where do folks run into sort of the most difficulty in running through these steps? And where's the biggest rub, or what are the challenges that folks face, and what are some guidelines in overcoming them?
I think there are two areas that really stand out. Many groups already collect disaggregated data, but haven't necessarily done what we call a root cause analysis. So really trying to understand the disparities. So root cause analysis, and then this is not a rub, but there's lots of interest in how to use and leverage racial equity impact assessments. And the grantees that we have, there are to our policy organizations, policy advocacy organizations, and then we also have, we work with lots of systems, child welfare and juvenile justice. And I think in terms of the root cause analysis, there's the I think there's the technical piece in making sure you have all of the right data, and then there are other pieces like needing to have impacted communities of color at the table with you to really help you understand the context to the data and to dig deeper. That community engagement piece is a new muscle, and so people are trying to work through that. And there are certainly ways, things to think about to do that effectively. And we are support all of our partners with as much as we can in that process. So we're in development of a webinar that could help people think about community engagement more deeply. And then the root cause analysis, a similar piece. It's really about asking the questions why, and depending on the context and the issue and the place, it's going to look different. But those are certainly areas where there isn't a lot of muscle yet, so everybody's doing
Right. Thanks. Are there any other questions? Folks can put it in, I think, their chat box, or they can put it in the questionnaire. They can raise their hand. There's lots of ways to ask Angelique questions about the toolkit or work that she's done in jurisdictions. If there aren't any more questions, then I think we can close out. Angelique, would it be all right if folks come up with a question later? Would it be okay for them to contact you?
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
And your email so they can contact you?
So my email is akedem, that's AKEDEM for Mary, at aecf.org.
Great.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, Angelique. It was great to hear about the toolkit, and we really appreciate you carving out some time to join us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I appreciate the interest and the energy, and we will continue to support you as much as we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.